The first time I saw my own handwriting in a file dated 4 years before I was born, I assumed it was a mistake. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late November, the kind of flat, gray day when the sky feels too low, and I was alone in the municipal records basement sorting through old parcel maps. The page was clipped inside a thin brown folder marked with a faded property number and a street name that, as far as I knew then, did not exist. The sheet was cheap copy paper, the ink slightly feathered from age. A short note at the bottom described an inspection visit, listed unusual interior measurements, and mentioned a complaint from neighbors about strange noises at night. At the end of the paragraph, a name was signed in blue ink. My name. It was not just the name. It was the way the letters leaned slightly to the right. The way the loop of the Y dipped a little too low. The short tail on the R where my pen always hesitated. It was the signature I had been writing on forms and receipts for years, down to the small, almost invisible hesitation between my first and last name. I remember standing there with the folder open on the metal cart, listening to the hum of the fluorescent lights and the fan in the corner, and feeling something like a slow, cold tide move through my chest. The top of the form clearly showed a date, July 14, 1986. That was more than a decade before I started working for the city. 4 years before I was even born. For a long time I just stared at it, telling myself all the reasonable things. Someone else with the same name. Someone in the office joking around years ago, copying my signature from somewhere and writing it on an old file just to mess with me. An error when the documents were scanned and reprinted. I named each theory, held it up in my mind, and felt each one collapse almost immediately under the weight of small details. The folder had not been opened recently. I could tell that from the dust along the edges and the stiffness of the old prongs. The handwriting at the top, where the clerk had labeled it in pencil, belonged to someone who had been retired for years. The paper itself was aged in a way that the newer reprints never were. It had that faint, acidic ivory color that came from storage and time. When I lifted it to my face, it smelled like old cardboard and toner. None of it felt recent. I did what people like me always do when confronted with something that does not fit. I told myself I would look into it properly later and slip the folder onto my cart. Then I finished my shift, logged the parcels I was supposed to log, and pretended that the small, quiet fracture in my sense of reality had not just occurred. At home that night, the folder sat on my kitchen table, lit by the weak light of the overhead fixture. I had taken it with me, which I was not technically supposed to do, but the idea of leaving it in the basement felt unbearable. I kept glancing at it while I made dinner, as if it might move on its own or be gone the next time I turned around. There is something you should understand about me. I am not someone who jumps to supernatural conclusions. I grew up around people who believed in ghosts and curses and omens, and maybe because of that, I went the other way. I like dates. I like legal descriptions. I like maps and the steady, reassuring logic of property boundaries. Numbers on deeds mean something fixed. Coordinates are coordinates. They do not change to suit moods or myths. That is why the street name on the folder bothered me almost as much as the date and the signature. It was written in neat, steady block letters, Ashfield Lane. I had lived in that town my entire life. I had driven, walked, or biked through almost every part of it. We did not have an Ashfield Lane. Even writing that now, I feel a deep, irrational resistance in myself. It is such a small thing, a missing street name. Streets get renamed, closed, merged. But sitting at the table that night, I pulled up the city GIS system on my laptop, zoomed in and out of the layers, and confirmed what I already believed. There was no record of Ashfield Lane in the current street index, in the archived versions, or in the old scan maps that went back to the 70s. Still, the folder in front of me bore the city seal and the correct formatting for an inspection report. It referenced complaints from neighbors, which implied other addresses around it. It listed a parcel number that should have tied it to a specific lot on a specific map. I told myself that if I could just locate that parcel, everything else would make sense. The parcel number was 14-082-17. I typed it into the GIS search bar, hit enter, and waited. The spinning wheel turned for a moment, then the screen showed a blank white square where a highlighted outline should have been. The search box at the top simply read, "No results." I tried again, entering the dashes slightly differently, checking for extra zeros. Nothing. The system behaved as if that combination of numbers had never existed. My hands were damp on the keyboard, and I wiped them on my jeans before reaching for the folder again. On the back of the inspection report, faintly, almost as if it had been pressed through from another sheet, a set of small numbers appeared in pencil. They looked like coordinates, or part of a map grid. It was hard to make them out, but as my eyes adjusted, I could see two strings, 41. 7329 and -88. 0124. I copied them into the search engine and opened the satellite map in another tab. The view zoomed in on a familiar section of town, the near west side, just past the river, where the older residential streets gave way to a patchwork of small warehouses, storage yards, and a derelict strip mall that had never really recovered after the big box stores moved out by the highway. The pin settled on a nondescript patch of land between two numbered streets. According to the label, it was just a vacant lot, overgrown with scrub and low trees. No road name. No Ashfield Lane. Seeing that pin on the map should have helped. It gave me something concrete to attach the mystery to. But instead of relief, I felt a subtle, hard-to-define unease. I knew that area. I had driven past it many times. In my memory, it had always just been a narrow stand of trees next to a chain-link fence and a failing auto repair shop. I could not, in all my years living there, remember ever seeing a house on that spot. Yet the inspection report in my hands described an existing structure. It mentioned interior rooms, stairs, a kitchen, and attic. It described odd, inconsistent measurements that did not seem to match the exterior dimensions of the building. It noted that neighbors reported hearing footsteps and voices at night when the house appeared dark from the street. It referenced a notice of violation that had been posted and then removed, though the file contained no copy of that notice. I read the report 3 times, then turned back to the bottom paragraph. My own name stared back up at me from the page. In the quiet of my kitchen, with the refrigerator cycling on and off and the lone murmur of a television through the wall from the apartment next door, I made a decision that, in retrospect, feels like the first step onto a path I did not fully understand. The next day, I would drive out to that empty lot. I did not sleep well. When I did drift off, my dreams were jittery and fractured. In one of them, I was standing at the edge of a narrow street lined with tall, square houses. Their windows were black, and no one moved behind the glass. The street sign above me was bent at an odd angle, the metal warped and blistered as if it had been exposed to extreme heat. I remember staring up at the sign and knowing that if I could just read the letters, everything would make sense. But the paint kept sliding out of focus, rearranging itself into different words every time I blinked. I woke up in the dark with the taste of rust in my mouth and a strange pressure in my ears, as if I had just come down quickly from a great height. For a moment, I did not know where I was. The walls of my bedroom looked unfamiliar, as if I were seeing them from slightly the wrong angle. Then my alarm buzzed on the nightstand, and reality slid back into place around me, dull and ordinary. Work that morning felt distant, my tasks mechanical. I processed permit applications, answered an email about a missing zoning overlay, attended a brief, tedious meeting about digitizing older code books. Through it all, a small part of my attention remained fixed on the folder in my bag and the coordinates scribbled in pencil. By the time my lunch break came around, my decision felt inevitable. I signed out, told the receptionist I was running an errand, and drove west. The sky was the same flat gray as the day before, the kind of color that makes it difficult to tell the time. The streets on that side of town were mostly quiet, with only the occasional truck passing by, rattling windows and leaving a faint smell of exhaust. When I turned onto the narrow side street that bordered the lot, I felt a tightness in my chest that I tried to ignore. The lot looked exactly as I remembered it, a slightly raised rectangle of land between two older buildings. Scrubby trees leaned over a low, broken curb. A few beer bottles glittered among the weeds. Someone had dumped an old mattress near the back fence. It was the kind of neglected urban gap that exists everywhere, unnoticed and unremarkable. I parked along the curb and sat with the engine off for a minute, watching the lot through the windshield. The wind stirred the branches slightly. Somewhere farther away, a dog barked. Nothing about the scene suggested that a house had ever stood there. I got out of the car. Up close, the ground was uneven underfoot, a mix of hard-packed dirt, patches of grass, and the dried, flattened remains of things people had thrown away. I scanned the ground for any hint of a foundation, a remnant of pavement, a stray brick. There was nothing. No leftover sidewalk leading nowhere, no abrupt change in vegetation suggesting old buried structures. It was just a vacant lot. I walked slowly toward the center, trying to match my position to the tiny satellite image on my phone. According to the pin, I was standing where the house in the report should have been. I turned in a slow circle, looking at the two adjacent buildings. On one side was a squat, windowless warehouse with a corrugated metal facade. On the other, a two-story brick building with boarded-up windows and a faded sign advertising office space for rent. Their side walls framed the empty space between them like parentheses. I remember thinking that maybe the house had been demolished years ago, and the records never updated correctly. Maybe the coordinates in the old file were slightly off. Maybe the entire thing was some strange clerical error that had slipped through the cracks. I clung to these explanations, saying them silently to myself while I stood on the bare ground with the wind tugging at the hem of my coat. Then I noticed something that at first seemed minor. At the back edge of the lot, near the fence, the ground sloped down slightly into a shallow depression. A path, faint but visible, had been worn into the dirt and sparse grass there, as if people or animals walked that same line regularly. The path did not lead from the street to the fence in a straight line, as you would expect if someone had been cutting through. Instead, it curved in a lazy, unnatural arc, like a segment of a circle whose center did not exist in the visible world. I followed the curve with my eyes and then with my feet. When I walked along it, I had the strange sensation that I was moving around something rather than toward anything. If I stood on the path and stretched out my arms, I could almost convince myself that my fingertips were brushing the invisible outline of a structure that was not there. This is the part of the story where I have to be careful, because I know how it sounds. I did not see a ghost. I did not feel a sudden electric chill or hear voices in my head. Nothing dramatic happened. I simply stood in that empty lot, on that faint curved path, and felt a subtle wrongness. The space around me did not feel consistent with what my eyes were telling me. It was like the auditory equivalent of seeing a dubbed film, where the words and the mouth movements almost matched but not quite. There was a small, persistent lag between what my senses reported and what my brain expected. I became aware of the sounds around me. Traffic on the main road a block away. The distant clank of metal from the warehouse. An airplane far overhead. The rustle of the trees. All normal. But beneath them, almost below the range of hearing, there was something else. A faint, rhythmic murmur that seemed to come from the ground itself. It was not language, not words. More like the suggestion of movement in another room, heard through a wall. I took a step backward, off the path, and the sensation lessened slightly. I stepped forward again, back into the curve, and it returned, a subtle pressure at the base of my skull. I repeated this several times, half expecting it to fade as my nerves calmed, but it did not. If anything, the contrast became clearer. Within the arc, the space felt thinner, as if the air itself had been stretched. Eventually, I forced myself to walk back to the car. I told myself I had been standing there too long, letting my imagination fill in the gaps. I told myself I had work to finish, that I could come back later with better equipment, proper measurements, maybe a colleague. I drove back to the office, logged in, and tried to focus on my tasks. But all afternoon, in the corner of my vision, I kept seeing that empty curve of ground. That night, I took the folder out again and spread its contents across my table. Along with the inspection report, there were a few other documents I had not looked at closely before. A previous complaint about unpermitted interior construction. A notice about property tax delinquency. A typed note from an anonymous caller claiming that the house did not appear on their utilities bill despite being clearly present on their street. And then, tucked behind the rest, a photocopy of a handwritten letter. The letter was undated, but the paper and ink suggested the late 80s or early 90s. The writer did not sign their full name, only initials. They described living on a street where one of the houses seemed to appear and disappear. Some nights, when they walked home late, they insisted there was a tall, narrow house between two others that was not there during the day. Lights burned in its upper windows. Shadows moved behind the curtains. But on bright afternoons, or when they walked the same route with friends, there was only a blank space, a narrow lot with overgrown grass. The letter went on to claim that when the house was there, the street itself felt different. Longer. Slightly narrower. The writer described walking past the narrow house and feeling that it took longer than it should to reach the corner. They described an odd echo between the houses, as if sound were trapped there. They mentioned seeing the same figure in the upstairs window on multiple nights, a still, dark shape that never moved. In the margin of the photocopy, in a different pen and a clerk's crisper script, someone had written, "No record of such property on Ashfield Lane, possibly prank?" I read the letter twice, then again, tracing the lines with my eyes. There was no return address, no obvious way to verify the account. But certain phrases caught at me. The sense of the street being longer when the house was present. The way the writer described the lot in daylight. It matched what I had seen, except that I had never seen the house itself. At that point, my curiosity had shifted into something stronger. It was no longer just about the coincidence of my name in an old file. It was about the possibility that there had once been, or might still be, a structure in my town that was somehow not fully part of it. A house that existed in the records but not on maps. A house some people saw and others did not. Over the next week, I did what I do best. I started digging through records. On my lunch breaks and after hours, I searched for any mention of Ashfield Lane in old city documents, newspaper archives, and even scanned microfilm from the local library. I made a list of addresses with similar parcel numbers. I pulled adjacent property files and looked for overlaps. I searched for utility accounts that did not line up with known structures. The pattern was not obvious at first. It emerged slowly, through dozens of small anomalies that most people would never notice. A meter reading logged for a house number that did not exist on a certain street. A complaint received from someone who described themselves as living between two addresses that were already consecutive. A brief note in a council meeting transcript where someone asked about an unlit property on a lane whose name did not match any current street. Every time I thought I had found something concrete, it slipped away. The address would turn out to be a typo. The lane name would match an earlier designation for a different street. The anomalies taken one by one were explainable. Only when I spread them all out, printed and laid side by side on my table, did a shape begin to form. Certain phrases repeated. Neighbors complaining about noises from an unseen source. People insisting that a house they had walked past for years was suddenly gone. A delivery driver reporting that a lane seemed to have an extra house one night that was not there the next. There were not many of these reports. Maybe a dozen over 40 years. But they clustered in one general part of town, around those coordinates on the map. As I followed those threads, something else happened that I did not, at first, connect to any of this. I began losing small pieces of time. The first instance was easy to dismiss. I sat down at my kitchen table one evening with a stack of photocopies, intending to work for half an hour before bed. The next time I looked up, my clock said it was nearly 2 in the morning. The papers in front of me were rearranged, as if I had sorted them into categories, but I did not remember doing it. I was not groggy the way you are after accidentally falling asleep. I just had a blank space where those hours should have been. The second time, I was at my desk at work, entering permit data. When I checked my watch, it said 11:30. I remember rubbing my eyes, thinking about lunch. The phone rang. I answered a brief call about a filing deadline. When I hung up and glanced at my watch again, it said 1:10. My desk looked different. Stacks of forms were in new positions. The half-empty coffee mug at my elbow was now completely empty and resting on a different coaster. My fingers hovered over the keyboard with the vague sense that they had been typing something a moment before. These gaps were small at first. 30 minutes. An hour. Here and there. I assumed I was tired, distracted, too absorbed in my research. I told myself I had simply forgotten the intervening tasks. But then I started noticing more concrete signs that something was off. On a Thursday evening, I went to the grocery store after work. I remember parking, going inside, walking down the first aisle. Then my memory jumps. The next thing I recall with any clarity is standing in my kitchen, setting bags down on the counter. The receipt was stuffed into one of the bags. When I checked the timestamp, it showed that nearly an hour and a half had passed between the time I remembered entering the store and the time printed for checkout. That in itself could have been nothing. Grocery trips blurred together. But one of the items on the receipt made my skin crawl. Under the usual list of bread, milk, eggs, and other staples, there was a line item for something I did not recognize: Ashfield tea, 1 unit. I stared at the word for a long moment. The brand meant nothing to me. I emptied the bags onto the counter, examined each item, checked the pantry and the fridge. There was no tea among my purchases. No unfamiliar box or bag. When I held the receipt up to the light, the printed line looked as solid and real as all the others. I could have gone back to the store and asked about it, but the thought of explaining my worry to a bored cashier or manager filled me with an inexplicable dread. So I folded the receipt and added it to the growing pile of oddities on my table. By this point, the gaps in my memory and the anomalies in the records started to feel connected in a way I could not yet articulate. I began to sense a pattern that had less to do with any specific house and more to do with absence itself. Empty lots where something should be. Missing hours where my life should be. The more I focused on Ashfield Lane, the more little pieces of my days seemed to evaporate. Then I found the second signature. It was a Saturday afternoon in the library, and I was scrolling through old microfilm of the local newspaper. I had already looked for mentions of unusual houses, sudden demolitions, or unexplained fires. Those searches had turned up nothing. So I started scanning the smaller items: community notices, obituaries, letters to the editor. In a late summer issue from 1991, my eye caught on a short piece buried in the back, under a heading for miscellaneous reports. A local inspector had resigned unexpectedly after a minor workplace incident. The article did not go into detail, but it mentioned that the inspector had experienced stress-related health issues following a complaint about an unlisted residence. The inspector's name was given in full. It was my name. Same spelling. Same middle initial. The article stated that the inspector had worked for the city for 8 years. That would have meant starting in 1983, 3 years before the inspection report I had found. It also mentioned that the inspector had no family in the area and had moved away after resigning. I sat back in my chair, feeling the plastic of the seat creak under me. Rationally, I knew that other people in the world shared my name. It was not the rarest combination. But another city inspector, in the same small town, with the same middle initial, leaving under a vague cloud after a run-in with an unlisted house. The coincidence felt too precise. I printed the article, added it to my folder, and walked out into the sinking yellow light of late afternoon. The parking lot outside the library was half empty. The air smelled faintly of exhaust and maple leaves. A breeze pushed a few torn flyers across the pavement. For a moment, the world felt thin, like a painted backdrop. That evening, I looked up the personnel records for past city employees. They were not all digitized, but enough of them had been scanned for me to search by name. When I typed my own into the system and set the date range to cover the 80s and early 90s, one result appeared. The file was marked as inactive and partially redacted. The summary page listed an employee with my name, title Inspector, start date in 1983, resignation accepted in 1991. The address on file was familiar, an apartment building only a few blocks from where I currently lived. The system showed no photograph attached. The notes section was brief and unhelpful. Subject: requested transfer of remaining benefits. No forwarding address. No family contact listed. I stared at the address line for a long time. The building still existed. I walked past it at least once a week. It was an older brick structure with narrow balconies and a pale, flaking trim. I had almost rented a unit there once, years before, but chose a different place instead. I sat in my chair and tried to imagine a version of myself living in that building in the late 80s, walking the same streets I now walked, working in the same office I worked in now, pulling files in the same basement. It felt less like thinking about another person and more like remembering something I could not quite bring into focus. Over the next few days, the gaps in my memory lengthened. Some of them began to cluster around specific kinds of activities. Any time I drove near that empty lot, for example, I would find my recollection of the journey blurred. I would start on one street and arrive at my destination with only the vaguest sense of the intervening blocks. Conversations at work occasionally seemed to jump, as if someone had edited out a middle section. I would start to explain a procedure to a colleague and then suddenly find myself standing alone at the copier, with no memory of how the conversation had ended. At first, I mentioned these lapses casually to a coworker, framing them as simple forgetfulness. They laughed and said we were all getting older, that the fluorescent lights in the office scrambled brains, that everyone was a little checked out. Their easy dismissal bothered me more than I admitted. Not because I wanted them to be concerned, but because it highlighted how invisible these gaps were from the outside. If I was losing pieces of my days, and no one noticed, what else could I be losing without realizing it? The answer came, or at least part of it, one night when I woke up abruptly at 3 in the morning with the sensation that someone was standing in the doorway of my bedroom. I did not leap up or turn on the light. I did not move at all. I lay on my back, staring into the dark, heart pounding. My eyes slowly adjusted, and the familiar outlines of my furniture emerged. The dresser. The chair with clothes draped over it. The blank rectangle of the doorway. It was empty. Still, the feeling persisted, that charged awareness of another presence. It reminded me of being in a room that you know has another exit behind you, even if you cannot see it. A subtle draw in the air, a directionality of space. Eventually, as my breathing slowed, I realized I could hear something very faint and distant. It was a rhythm, almost like footsteps, but muffled, as if audible through thick walls or from far below. They did not match the sound of anyone walking in the hallway or on the floor above. Those noises I knew well, the creaks and thumps of my building settling around its residents. This was different. It had a peculiar regularity, and it seemed to come from a direction that did not align with the layout of my apartment. Half awake, I tried to map it. The sound seemed to be coming from the right side of my bed, but slightly lower, as if from beneath the floor. That made no sense. The apartment below mine was empty at the time, its last tenant gone weeks before, according to the mailboxes and the occasional conversation in the stairwell. I had never heard anyone moving down there. The rational part of my mind knew that sounds can travel in unpredictable ways through old buildings. Pipes, vents, beams. The noise could have been anything. But as I lay there, listening in the dark, the cadence of those muffled steps began to match something in my memory. The faint, rhythmic murmur I had heard in the empty lot when I stood on that curved path. I did not sleep again that night. The next day, I called in sick to work. My voice on the phone sounded thin and remote to my own ears, like a recording played at slightly the wrong speed. After hanging up, I stood in my kitchen for a long time, staring at nothing, and then I went to my bedroom and pulled the bed away from the wall. The floorboards underneath were unremarkable. Scuffed from years of furniture, dusty along the edges. I knelt and pressed my ear against the wood. At first, all I heard was the rush of my own blood and the hum of the refrigerator. Then, faintly, like a remembered song, there was that suggestion of footsteps again. I cannot explain what made me do it next. I have never been especially prone to impulsive behavior. But something about the alignment of the anomalies, the signatures, the missing time, and the sounds pooled together into a certainty that if I did not act now, I might never understand any of it. I went to the closet, pulled out a box of old tools left behind by a previous tenant, and returned with a screwdriver and a small pry bar. The boards near the center of the room were narrower than the ones by the walls, and one of them had a hairline gap along its edge that looked slightly wider than the others, as if it had been lifted at some point in the past. Working slowly, trying not to splinter the wood, I pried up that board and then the one next to it. Beneath them was not the expected layer of subfloor and insulation. There was a cavity about a foot deep, and beyond that, darkness. I fetched a flashlight. When I shone the beam into the gap, I saw stairs. They were narrow, steep, and much older than the apartment above. The wood was worn smooth in the center of each step, as if by many feet over many years. A dry, cool draft of air floated up from below, carrying with it a faint smell I could not immediately place. It was not damp, not mold. It was something like old paper and dust and the lingering trace of a long-extinguished fire. I know how this sounds. Secret stairs beneath my bedroom floor. Hidden spaces in an ordinary apartment building. It suggests a dramatic, cinematic kind of revelation. But in that moment, what I felt most strongly was a kind of quiet inevitability. Of course there were stairs. Of course there was some other space beneath my life that I had not known about. Everything leading up to that moment seemed to converge, as if I had been walking in slow circles around an unseen center and had finally reached it. I sat on the edge of the opening for a while, legs dangling over the void, flashlight beam tracing the curve of the steps. They descended into darkness, turning slightly out of sight after the first few feet. There was no railing. The walls on either side looked to be made of old brick, rough and uneven. Eventually, because not going down felt more dangerous than going, I placed my feet on the first step. The wood felt solid under my weight. I tested it, then shifted more of myself onto the stairs and lowered my body into the space below. The air wrapped around me, cooler and still. I paused, listening. The sounds of the apartment above faded quickly, muffled by the boards. All that remained was my own breathing, a distant hum that might have been the building's electrical system, and the faint, intermittent creak of the stairs under my feet. I descended. The flashlight beam wobbled slightly with my movements, carving pale arcs across the bricks. Dust motes spun in the light like tiny, aimless planets. After the first turn, the stairway straightened and continued downward for longer than made sense. Logically, I knew I should have reached the ceiling of the apartment below mine after 10 or 12 feet at most. But the stairs kept going. I counted the steps to anchor myself. 15. 20. 25. My legs began to ache. The air grew cooler. A subtle pressure built in my ears, the same sensation you feel in a descending elevator, except there was no corresponding change in light or sound. The world above might as well have been miles away. At around 40 steps, the staircase ended in a small landing. The beam of my flashlight revealed a narrow corridor extending forward into darkness. The walls here were not brick but wood, paneled in a style I recognized from older houses in town. Vertical boards painted in a color that might once have been white but now lay in shades of gray and yellow. The smell of old paper was stronger here, mixed with something metallic and faintly bitter. I moved forward, one hand skimming the wall for balance. The corridor was just wide enough for my shoulders, and the ceiling was low. I felt enclosed in a way that would have been unbearable if I had allowed myself to think about it too much. So I did not. I focused instead on small details. The pattern of nails in the boards. The faint scratches along the lower sections of the walls, as if furniture had once been dragged through this space. After a few yards, the corridor opened into a larger room. My flashlight swept across what at first appeared to be a typical unfinished basement, concrete floor, exposed beams overhead, a few old boxes stacked in a corner. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw that the proportions were wrong. The room was deeper than it was wide, almost like a hall. Along one wall, a series of doorways stood evenly spaced, their doors closed. Along the opposite wall, there were no doors, only a continuous stretch of paneling and a few old, disconnected light fixtures. I stepped into the center of the room and turned slowly. The doors were plain, without numbers or labels, all painted in that same faded not quite white. Their handles were tarnished brass. None of them looked particularly sinister. They were simply there, waiting. At the far end of the room, directly opposite the corridor I had emerged from, stood another door, slightly larger than the others. Unlike the rest, it had a transom window above it, its glass opaque with grime. Something about its position and size made it feel more central, more important. I became aware again of that faint rhythmic sound, like footsteps or the suggestion of movement in another room. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, diffused through the walls and floor. My skin prickled. I approached the nearest of the smaller doors and hesitated with my hand on the knob. A thought struck me then, simple and terrifying. If these rooms exist beneath my apartment, beneath the apartment below mine, beneath the building as a whole, then they exist outside of any official plan. They are not on the blueprints. They are not in the fire code diagrams. They are not accounted for in any record I have ever seen. Places that are not recorded do not have to follow the rules of recorded places. I turned the knob. The door opened easily, swinging inward with only a small creak. My flashlight beam revealed a narrow room, empty except for a single wooden chair in the center, and a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. There were no windows. The air inside was still and slightly colder than the hall. A thin layer of dust coated the floor, except for a few faint tracks near the door that could have been mine or someone else's from some other time. I closed the door and moved to the next. This one contained shelves along every wall, mostly empty. In one corner, a pile of old newspapers lay crumpled and yellowed. I did not step inside. Something about the way the shelves loomed in the beam of my light made me uneasy, as if invisible objects might be watching me from their empty surfaces. The third door opened onto a room that was somehow wrong in a way I struggled to define even as I stood there. At first glance, it seemed like another empty space. But the angles of the walls did not align with my sense of depth. When I swept the flashlight across, the far corner seemed both closer and farther away than it should be. The lines of the paneling converged and diverged in a way that made me feel slightly nauseated. I closed that door quickly, heart racing. I made my way down the row, opening each door in turn. Some rooms were empty. Others contained small remnants of something: a rolled-up rug, a cracked mirror leaning against the wall, a cardboard box full of obsolete electrical components. None of these items were extraordinary on their own. They were the kind of forgotten junk you might find in any basement. But there was no dust on some of them, as if they had been recently handled, though there was no sign that anyone else had been down here. At last, I stood before the larger door at the end of the hall. Here, the faint sound that might have been footsteps seemed clearer, though it still did not resolve into anything I could pinpoint. It was like standing near, but not quite inside, the main compartment of an old clock, hearing gears turning in another chamber. The air near this door felt colder against my face. I reached up and ran my fingers along the frame. Though it was smoother here, warmed by many hands. When I turned the knob and pushed, the door resisted for a moment, as if something heavy leaned against it from the other side. Then, with a slight shudder, it opened. The room beyond was larger than I expected, its dimensions more like those of a living room than a storage space. My flashlight revealed walls paneled in the same faded wood, a low ceiling crossed by dark beams, and a floor covered in scuffed wooden planks. Against one wall stood a narrow table with a mirror above it. Against another, an empty fireplace with a cracked mantel. In the center of the room, a worn rug lay on the floor, its original pattern obscured by age. My breath caught as the beam of my flashlight slid across the far wall. There, between two narrow windows that should not have been possible this far below ground, hung a framed document. The glass was dusty, the frame chipped, but the paper within was clearly visible. It was an inspection certificate. I moved closer, my shoes making small hollow sounds on the floor. The certificate bore the city seal, the same layout and fonts as the ones I processed at work, though the style was older. It listed the address of the property inspected, a description of the structure, a date, and the name of the inspector. The address line read 17 Ashfield Lane. The date was July 14, 1986. And beneath it all, in slightly faded blue ink, was my signature. The room seemed to tilt around me. For a moment, I felt as if gravity had shifted sideways, pulling me towards that piece of paper. I reached out and touched the glass. It was cold. Here, in a space that should not exist, hanging on a wall between impossible windows, was the original document the photocopy in my folder had been taken from. The same page, the same wording, the same crooked loop of the Y in my name. I traced the letters with my eyes, then forced myself to step back and look at the rest of the room. The windows on either side of the certificate were black. No light shone through from outside. When I approached them and peeled back the edges of the rotting curtains, I saw not earth or foundation walls, but the faint outline of another room beyond the glass. It was difficult to make out details, but it looked like a hallway, with more doors and a small table holding what might have been a lamp. It felt as if I were looking not out of a basement into the ground, but from one interior space into another, adjacent and offset. The thought made my skin crawl. On the table below the mirror lay a few objects, a set of old keys, a folded brochure for some long-closed local business, and a small, leather-bound notebook. The notebook drew my attention immediately. It was the kind of thing inspectors sometimes carried, a place to jot notes and observations in the field. The leather was worn, the corners rounded, and the elastic band that held it shut had long since lost its elasticity and hung loose. My hands shook slightly as I picked it up. On the inside cover, a name was written in blue ink. My name. The letters were identical to those on the certificate and the report. Below the name was an address in neat block letters. It was the same apartment building listed on the personnel file. The handwriting was mine. The pages of the notebook were filled with cramped notes, sketches, and measurements. Some entries were clearly related to routine inspections, furnace issues, wiring problems, violations of egress code. Others were harder to interpret. Rough diagrams of floor plans that did not quite match any known building. Lists of street names with one or two scratched out or circled. Notations about sounds, smells, and impressions that had no place in an official report. As I flipped through the pages, something unsettling began to happen. Certain phrases, sentences, or even full paragraphs felt eerily familiar, as if I had written them at some point and then forgotten. Not the content, exactly, but the rhythm of the words, the way metaphors were chosen, the structure of the thoughts. It was like reading old journal entries written during a period of my life that had slipped out of memory. Except the dates at the top of the entries all predated my birth. Near the back of the notebook, several pages had been torn out, leaving only ragged edges along the spine. On the last intact page, a short note stood on its own, written more hastily than the rest. It said, in essence, that the house on Ashfield Lane did not stay in one place. That it shifted between gaps in the town, slipping into whatever empty lot or neglected space it could find. That sometimes, it seemed to stretch existing streets, adding a house where none had been before and then removing it, leaving only a sense of absence behind. The note ended with an observation I cannot fully forget. The writer claimed that the house did not just occupy physical gaps in the town. It also seemed to nestle into gaps in memory and record. People would forget walking past it. Photographs taken in its vicinity would come out blurred or missing sections. Official documents would rearrange themselves subtly, reassigning addresses and parcel numbers, as if making room for something that refused to be documented. As I read those words, a chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cold air in the room. The notebook did not describe the house as a traditional haunting, with ghosts or curses. It described it as a kind of structural parasite, feeding on omissions and oversights. It grew in whatever cracks existed between what was recorded and what was not, between what people noticed and what they ignored. It exploited the gaps in attention that come from boredom, fatigue, and routine. It extended that exploitation beyond the physical into the mental, and perhaps even into the bureaucratic. The last line of the page was underlined twice. The house is most dangerous when you do not remember that you have seen it. I stood there, notebook in hand, staring at that line, and realized that I might already have seen the house more times than I could recall. The missing hours. The sense of déjà vu on certain streets. The unexplained items on receipts. The feeling of a longer than expected walk home through familiar neighborhoods. What if those were not just lapses in concentration, but places where something had inserted itself into my path, and then removed the evidence from my mind? Another thought followed quickly, chilling and inevitable. If the house could inhabit gaps in memory, then it could perhaps create them. If it could rearrange documents and records to accommodate itself, then maybe it could also rearrange my own history, smoothing over any encounters with it like a hand smoothing rumpled fabric. In that scenario, what was I, standing there in that impossible basement, holding a notebook written by someone with my name decades ago? I felt a sudden, irrational need to get out. The room seemed to close in around me. The walls leaned inward a fraction of an inch, the floor subtly tipped, the air thickened. I put the notebook back on the table, more carefully than I intended, as if worried I might disturb something delicate. I took one last look at the certificate on the wall, at my own signature watching me across time, and then I turned and left. The corridor and the stairs felt longer on the way up. For a moment, halfway, I had the disorienting sensation that the direction of gravity might reverse, sending me tumbling sideways into some unseen space. But the pull remained consistent. Step by step, I climbed back toward the small rectangle of light at the top of the stairs, where my bedroom waited. When I finally emerged and stood in my familiar room, with the afternoon sun slanting across the floorboards, everything looked subtly wrong. The bed was at a slightly different angle than before. The curtains were drawn to a different degree. A mug on my nightstand had shifted a few inches. They were small details, easily attributable to my own movements, but I could not shake the sense that the entire room had been rearranged in my absence by someone trying to replicate it from memory, and missing by small margins. I replaced the lifted floorboards, pressing them back into place. They settled with a soft, final-sounding thud, as if they had been waiting for that exact moment to fit perfectly. When I pushed the bed back over the area, I hesitated, feeling as though I were covering a wound. In the days that followed, the gaps in my memory did not disappear. Some even seemed to multiply. But I had gained something I had not had before, an awareness of their shape. I began to notice where the absences clustered. Certain streets. Certain times of day. Certain errands that left me with receipts I did not remember collecting. I also started to see, or thought I saw, hints of the house itself. It is difficult to describe, because every sighting felt incomplete, like trying to recall a face from a dream. Walking home one evening, I turned down a residential street I knew well and felt a momentary jolt of vertigo. The space between two familiar houses seemed narrower or wider than it should have been. A dim light glowed in what might have been an upper window where I remembered only blank brick. But when I looked directly at it, the light was gone, the space empty. Another time, driving on the west side near the industrial area, I passed a narrow lane I was sure had never been there before. It sloped down between two warehouses, lined with tall, thin houses squeezed close together. I felt an almost overpowering urge to turn onto it, to follow it, and count the number of doors. Instead, I kept driving, eyes fixed on the main road. In my rearview mirror, I watched the lane recede. By the time I reached the corner and glanced back again, it was no longer visible. I started keeping my own notebook, a cheap spiral one I could carry everywhere. I wrote down any small discrepancy I noticed, a house where I did not remember one being, a lot that felt subtly rearranged, a sense of distance or duration not matching the reality of a trip. I noted any missing time, no matter how short. Over weeks, then months, patterns formed. Certain cross streets showed up again and again. Certain corners. Certain empty spaces wedged between more solid, documented structures. The house, or whatever presence occupied those gaps, seemed to favor liminal zones, places between zones of commerce and residence, between older and newer development, between the visible and the neglected. As my awareness grew, so did my sense of being watched. Not in the dramatic, cinematic sense of feeling eyes on the back of my neck, but in a quieter, more insidious way. It was as if the town itself had subtly reoriented, tilting towards me. The ordinary background noise of daily life took on a new tone, a faint underlying harmony I had not noticed before. The rhythms of traffic, of footsteps, of doors opening and closing, all seemed to sync occasionally with that distant, almost subaudible pulse I had first heard in the empty lot. It was around this time that my colleagues began to comment on my appearance. They said I looked tired. They asked if I was working too hard. I answered with vague assurances that I was fine, just busy. I did not tell them that sometimes, in the middle of the day, I would glance at a clock and find that an entire hour had vanished while I sat at my desk, pen in hand, staring at a blank space in a file where a property description should be. I also did not tell them about the strange discrepancies I began to find in the office's own records. They were small at first. A street index listing a lane that was not on any map, then listing it differently the next day. A file folder that contained a document one afternoon and did not contain it the following morning, with no sign it had been removed. A digital entry in the permit database that changed address information overnight, with no corresponding log of an edit. I started secretly printing or photographing any such anomaly as soon as I noticed it, timestamping my copies and adding them to the ever-growing pile in my apartment. Sometimes, when I checked back later, the original would have corrected itself, as if the error had never existed. Only my printed proof remained. The more evidence I collected, the less stable my own sense of sequence became. My life began to feel like a series of snapshots with missing frames between them. More than once, I woke up in my bed with the distinct memory of having gone to sleep in another room or another place entirely. I would find items on my kitchen counter that I did not remember purchasing, and then, later, they would be gone without my remembering using or discarding them. The obvious explanation, the one that any reasonable person would suggest, is that I was suffering from some sort of neurological or psychological condition. I considered that possibility seriously. I researched dissociative episodes, temporal lobe seizures, and various forms of amnesia. I made an appointment with a doctor, then cancelled it. Not because I felt entirely well, but because I could not shake the conviction that whatever was happening was not entirely inside my head. The turning point came when I received a notice in the mail that I knew could not be directed at anyone else. It was a slim envelope, plain, with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper printed in the same style as our official inspection forms, though on cheaper stock. At the top, in bold letters, it said that an inspection of my property had been conducted in response to a complaint. Below that, a brief summary described certain anomalies, inconsistent interior measurements, reports of unusual sounds and disturbances, discrepancies between the recorded layout and the observed reality. At the bottom of the page, a name was printed, along with the title Inspector. It was my name. The date at the top of the notice was 2 days in the future. I read the notice 3 times, holding it under different lamps as if the words might change. They did not. The paper was real. The ink smudged slightly when I rubbed my thumb over it. The city seal at the top was slightly off-center, as if someone had tried to replicate the form from memory rather than copying it exactly. My apartment number was correct. So was my full name. The future date, however, refused to resolve into anything sensible in my mind. An inspection would be conducted in 2 days by an inspector with my name, of my own property, based on a complaint describing exactly the anomalies I had discovered beneath my floor and in my life. The thought looped in my head, never quite completing. For 2 days, I lived in a state of heightened, nearly unbearable alertness. Every sound in the hallway outside my apartment door made me stiffen. I expected a knock that never came. I rehearsed explanations, denials, confessions. None of them felt convincing, even to myself. On the morning of the date listed on the notice, I woke before dawn and sat in my kitchen watching the lights slowly change. The city outside moved through its usual motions. Cars started. People left for work. Children walked to school. My own building creaked and settled. Time passed in a way that felt both excruciatingly slow and disconcertingly fast. The knock, when it finally came, was so quiet that at first I was not sure I had heard it. A soft, almost tentative sound, as if someone were testing the solidity of the door rather than demanding entry. I stood up, my chair scraping a little too loudly on the floor, and walked down the short hallway. My hand hesitated on the doorknob. A ridiculous thought flickered through me, that if I never opened the door, the inspection would not happen. As if the act of observing would solidify some reality I was not ready to accept. Eventually, because standing there forever was not an option, I turned the knob and opened the door. There was no one there. The hallway was empty, lit by the same buzzing fluorescent tube that had flickered for months. The worn carpet stretched in both directions, marked by the usual scuffs and stains. The air smelled faintly of dust and someone's cooking from another floor. No footsteps faded in the distance. No voices echoed up from the stairwell. For a moment, I wondered if the knock had been my imagination after all. Then I looked down. On the floor, directly in front of my door, lay a folder. It was identical in style and weight to the one I had found in the municipal basement weeks before. Thin, brown, slightly bent at the corners. No label on the tab. No markings on the outside. I picked it up and brought it inside, closing the door gently behind me. My hands felt numb. I set the folder down on the kitchen table, the same table where I had opened the first one, and stood for a long moment, staring at it as if it might open on its own. Eventually, I slid my fingers under the edge of the cover and lifted it. Inside was a single inspection report. The layout matched our standard form exactly. The date at the top was today's. The property address listed was my own. The summary described, in precise detail, the existence of undocumented stairs beneath the bedroom floor, an unrecorded basement, and multiple rooms not included in any official plan. It noted the presence of an inspection certificate from 1986 bearing the same name as the current inspector. It referenced a notebook containing prior observations. The narrative sections of the report read like a concise version of the story you have been hearing from me now. It was as if someone had taken my experiences, stripped away the digressions and emotional reactions, and laid them out in clean, neutral language. The tone was professional, detached, almost bland. Only the facts, as observed. At the bottom of the page, above the line for signature, my name was printed. The signature itself consisted of a single diagonal line, as if someone had started to sign and then stopped. For a moment, I considered picking up a pen and completing it. It would have been easy. My hand knew the motion. I could have connected that line to the rest of my name, closing the loop. Signing would have acknowledged the reality of the inspection, confirmed the observations, and sealed them into the official record. Instead, I closed the folder and set it aside. I do not know if that choice mattered. I do not know if anything I have done or not done has had any real impact on whatever the house on Ashfield Lane is or does. I only know that after that day, the nature of my experience shifted. The gaps in my memory did not stop, but they changed character. They became less like abrupt absences and more like hazy overlaps, as if multiple versions of events pressed against each other, leaving me uncertain which one belonged to my particular line of continuity. I would remember walking home on one route, and then find photographic evidence on my phone that I had taken another. I would recall a conversation with a colleague that clearly could not have happened in the time frame I believed. The anomalies in the records at work became less frequent, or perhaps I simply became less able to distinguish them from ordinary bureaucratic noise. Files were always going missing, addresses always changing, documents always being updated. The town continued to function in its usual and perfect way. People received their permits, or were denied them. Buildings were erected and demolished according to plans that mostly matched reality. Occasionally, I would still catch a glimpse of something that did not fit, A lane appearing on a map layer, and then vanishing. A house number that jumped from 15 to 19 with no 17 in between. A complaint from a resident who insisted that the distance between their front door and the corner had increased overnight. I noted these, added them to the piles in my apartment, but my sense of urgency dulled. It was not acceptance, exactly. More like fatigue. I went back to the empty lot on the west side twice more. The second time, I stood again on the faint curved path and felt that subtle wrongness in the air, the stretched quality of space. The third time, I found no path at all. The ground was more overgrown, the curve smoothed out. A new sign had been posted near the curb, indicating that the property was slated for development. A small architectural rendering showed a future row of townhouses, neat and generic. I do not know if those townhouses will ever be built. If they are, I do not know whether they will sit entirely in our recorded world or partly in that other place that feeds on absences. I imagine future residents moving in, hanging curtains, learning the peculiarities of their new homes, and occasionally waking in the middle of the night with the sense that the hallway is slightly longer than it was the day before. As for the house itself, the one some have called the Ashfield house, I do not know if it is a single structure in any meaningful sense. It might be more accurate to say that it is a pattern. A configuration that repeats wherever conditions allow. A way for a building to exist not entirely in space, but in the gaps between what is noticed and what is documented. Sometimes, when I walk through town, I feel that pattern brush against me. In the shadowed side yards between older homes. In the dead-end alleys behind shops. In the dim, unused stairwells of municipal buildings. It is like sensing a familiar face in a crowd without being able to pick it out. A familiarity that registers in the body before the mind can name it. I am aware that everything I have told you could be interpreted in other ways. It could be the product of a mind under strain, bending mundane coincidences into a narrative of haunting because the alternative, that life is merely random and indifferent, is harder to bear. It could be evidence of some untreated condition, a misfiring of neurons that creates patterns where none exist. It could be a story I have told myself so many times that it has solidified into reality in my own perception, even if no one else shares it. But I have those papers. I have the photocopy of an inspection report from 1986 bearing my handwriting. I have a printed article about an inspector with my name resigning over an unlisted house. I have receipts with inexplicable items, maps with streets that flicker in and out of existence, notes in my own hand describing places I do not consciously remember visiting. I have the memory of narrow stairs beneath my floor and a room with impossible windows. I do not know if the notebook I found in that basement still exists. On a recent impulse, I opened the floor again and went down. The stairs were there, though they creaked more than before. The corridor and the doors were there, though some of the rooms had changed. Where there had once been a chair, there was now a stack of bricks. Where there had been empty shelves, there were now old filing cabinets. The large room at the end still hung with the inspection certificate on the wall, but when I looked closely, the signature at the bottom was complete. My full name, written in confident blue ink. On the table, where the notebook had once lain, there was nothing. Perhaps I took it away during one of my missing hours and placed it somewhere I have since forgotten. Perhaps it never existed except at the moment I needed it to. Perhaps it now sits on a shelf in some other version of this town, where another version of me has made different choices. I sometimes wonder how many times this cycle has repeated. How many inspectors, clerks, researchers, or simply curious residents have followed the faint trail of anomalies to the threshold of the house and stepped through. How many have found their own signatures in old files, their own names in forgotten articles? How many have tried to write down what they saw, only to have their notes absorbed into the house's ever-shifting geography? When I lie awake at night and listen for faint footsteps beneath my floor, I think about that earlier inspector, the one from the 80s. I imagine him standing in a different version of my apartment, holding a different version of that notice, feeling perhaps the same mixture of dread and compulsion I felt. I imagine him descending stairs that might have been in another corner of the room, opening doors that led to rooms arranged differently than the ones I saw. I imagine him looking up at a certificate on a wall, and seeing his own name as I saw mine. I do not know what happened to him. Officially, he resigned, moved away, left no forwarding address. Unofficially, he may have simply slipped into one of the gaps between what is recorded and what is forgotten, just as the house does. Sometimes, in the half-light of early morning, when the town is quiet and the sky is the same color as old paper, I have a disturbing sense that I am already halfway along that same path. Small things vanish from my life and reappear in places they should not be. People I thought I knew well greet me with the slight reserve of acquaintances, as if our histories do not entirely align. Streets I have driven down for years feel unfamiliar in subtle ways. A building that I am sure housed a laundromat last month now contains a tax preparation office, with no sign of a recent change. I find sticky notes on my own desk in my own handwriting reminding me of tasks I do not recall assigning myself. One of them, discovered recently under a folder, contained only 3 words. Do not sign. I have no memory of writing it, though the loops and angles are mine. So I have not signed. Not the incomplete inspection report that arrived at my door. Not the new forms that occasionally cross my desk with my name pre-printed at the bottom. Not the updated certificate that hangs in that impossible room below, waiting perhaps for some formal acknowledgement that will lock these events into a single, definitive version. I do not know if refusing to sign changes anything. The house on Ashfield Lane, if that is even the right name, continues to exist in the spaces where no one looks too closely. It appears and disappears in the unnoticed margins of our town, stretching and collapsing streets, feeding on our inattention. It will do so whether or not my name is neatly written at the bottom of any particular document. What I can do is remember, as best I can. I can keep writing down the small discrepancies, the missing minutes, the flickering streets. I can resist, in my limited way, the house's tendency to smooth over its presence with forgetfulness. I can hold on to the knowledge that there is, beneath my feet and behind certain walls, a set of rooms that do not belong here, connected to other rooms in other places by stairs that descend farther than they should. And I can tell you all of this, now, in as much detail as I am able. Because if the house thrives in gaps of memory and record, then perhaps the only thing that keeps it from swallowing more of our world is the thin, fragile thread of stories like this one. Imperfect, subjective, fragmented, but anchored in the stubborn insistence of a single voice saying, I was there, even if the records say I was not. When I finish writing this, I will put down my pen and look around my apartment. I will count the doors and windows. I will measure the distance from my bed to the corner, and from the kitchen table to the front door. I will check the floorboards and the walls, confirming that they are where I remember them being. Then I will close my eyes and listen. If I hear those faint, rhythmic footsteps below the usual sounds of the building, I will not pretend they are nothing. I will acknowledge them, nod to them silently, and remind myself of the empty lot on the west side, the bend in the path, the impossible windows in the underground room. I will remember the signature in blue ink on the certificate and the line that was never completed on the report. I will remind myself not to go back downstairs. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Because the house knows my name, and I have given it enough of my time already. Still, as I sit here now, there is one thought I cannot quite shake. Somewhere in the town, perhaps a few blocks away, perhaps on the other side of the river, there may be a narrow street that is a little longer tonight than it was yesterday. A house no one recalls seeing before may stand between 2 others, lights glowing softly in its upper windows. Someone walking home late might glance up, feel a flicker of unease, and then, by the time they reach their door, forget entirely that there was ever anything unusual about their route. And inside that house, in a room that does not appear on any plan, there might be a table with a notebook on it. On the inside cover, a name might be written. It could be mine again, or yours, or someone else's who has not yet noticed the missing minutes in their day. If that ever happens to you, if you ever come across your own handwriting in a place where it cannot reasonably be, or feel that a street you know intimately has stretched itself while you were not looking, I hope some faint echo of this account will surface in your mind. Not as proof. Not as a warning that can prevent anything definite. Just as a small, persistent discomfort. A reminder that not everything that exists needs your belief to persist. Some things, like the house on Ashfield Lane, only need you to look away.